The dungeon smelled of damp stone and forgotten souls, a scent Lyra had grown accustomed to over the 5 years she had worked in the bowels of the royal palace. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she wrung out the cloth in the bucket of herbal water, the liquid glowing faintly with the remnants of her healing magic. It was not much, this gift of hers. Barely enough to earn her the title of healer, and certainly not enough to manifest a wolf. In a world where your worth was measured by the strength of your inner beast, Lyra was considered broken, defective, a waste of omega blood. She did not mind the solitude of the dungeons anymore. Up above, in the glittering halls of the palace, she would only face sneers and whispers, the casual cruelty of those who believed themselves superior. Down here, among the prisoners and the shadows, she could almost pretend she was invisible. Almost. Her current assignment was one that both fascinated and terrified her. At the end of the longest corridor, behind 7 sealed doors engraved with ancient warding symbols, lay the crystal tomb. Inside that tomb, preserved in eternal sleep, was Alpha King Caius Thornridge, the monster of legends, the tyrant whose name mothers used to frighten disobedient children. He had ruled 300 years ago with an iron fist, or so the histories claimed, until a powerful witch had cursed him to sleep forever as punishment for his countless atrocities. Lyra pushed open the final door, her small frame struggling against its weight. The chamber beyond took her breath away every single time. The walls were carved from obsidian and veined with silver, pulsing with dormant magic. In the center of the room stood the crystal coffin, easily 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, filled with a shimmering liquid that looked like liquid moonlight. And suspended in that liquid, perfect and terrifying, was Caius Thornridge himself. He was massive even in repose, his body that of a warrior king, all carved muscle and imposing presence. His hair was long and dark, floating around his face like a black halo. His features were harsh, all sharp angles and aristocratic lines, a face that could have been sculpted by an artist obsessed with power and beauty in equal measure. But it was his aura that truly marked him as Alpha, even in sleep. It pressed against her senses like a physical weight, ancient and overwhelming. Lyra approached the coffin with the reverence of ritual. This was her duty. 3 times a week, to clean the crystal surface, to refresh the preservation spells, to ensure that the sleeping king remained trapped in his cursed slumber. She was the only one allowed this task, perhaps because she was considered so insignificant that even if she tried to wake him, she would fail. As she worked, wiping away the dust that somehow always accumulated despite the sealed chamber, she did what she always did. She talked to him. It had started as a way to fill the oppressive silence, but over the years it had become something more. A confessional, a therapy, a connection to someone who could never judge her because he could never hear her. Today had been particularly difficult. She had been summoned to heal one of Alpha King Darian's mistresses, a beta woman who had grown bored and amused herself by burning Lyra's arm with a hot poker, laughing as she did it. The burn still throbbed beneath the bandage Lyra had wrapped around it. She traced her fingers along the crystal as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She told Caius about the pain, about the humiliation, about how sometimes she wondered if her life had any purpose at all beyond being a target for the cruelty of others. She told him things she would never dare speak aloud to anyone living, secrets and fears and tiny rebellious thoughts that could get her executed if anyone ever heard them. When she finished her work, she did something she had never done before. She pressed her palm flat, against the crystal, directly above where his heart would be, and she closed her eyes. Her magic, weak as it was, pulsed through her hand, not trying to heal because he was not wounded, but simply reaching out, a desperate connection from one lonely soul to another. For just a moment, she could have sworn she felt something push back, a flutter of response, a whisper of consciousness. But then it was gone, and she was alone again with her foolish imagination. She left the chamber as she always did, sealing each of the 7 doors behind her, never knowing that in the liquid-filled darkness, behind closed eyelids that had not opened in 3 centuries, something had finally stirred. That night, Lyra dreamed. She stood in a forest of silver trees beneath a moon so bright it hurt to look at directly. The air smelled of pine and something wilder, something that made her omega instincts rise with both fear and strange anticipation. She was not alone. He stood before her, tall and imposing, and impossibly real. Caius Thornridge. But he was not suspended in liquid anymore. He was flesh and blood and burning eyes that fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. His voice, when he spoke, was like thunder rolling across mountains, deep and ancient and edged with centuries of pain. He asked her if she was real or another phantom conjured by his desperate mind. He told her he had been aware, trapped in his own body for 300 years, unable to move or speak or scream, only able to drift in the prison of his thoughts while the world forgot him. Lyra tried to speak, but found she could not form words. He stepped closer, and she realized he was crying, silent tears streaming down that harsh face. He told her he had heard her, every word she had spoken to him over the years, every confession and fear and tiny act of kindness. He told her she was the only light in an eternity of darkness, the only proof that compassion still existed in a world that had become so cruel. When he reached out to touch her face, his hand passed through her like smoke, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound it shattered something inside her chest. Then she woke, gasping and trembling in her tiny servant's quarters, convinced it had been nothing more than an unusually vivid dream, brought on by exhaustion and loneliness. But the next time she entered the crystal chamber, she felt it immediately. The change in the air, the way his presence seemed more focused somehow, more aware. She approached the coffin with trembling hands and looked at his face. His eyes were still closed, his body still suspended. But there was something different. A tension in his jaw, a slight furrow in his brow. She whispered his name, barely audible even in the silence. And in response, the liquid in the coffin rippled, just once, as if something inside had moved. That night, he was waiting for her in the dream forest. This time she could speak, and they talked until the dream faded with the approaching dawn. He explained what he believed was happening, that her magic, weak as she thought it was, had somehow created a bridge between them, a connection through the realm of dreams, where his consciousness could escape the prison of his cursed body. Over the following weeks, their nightly meetings became Lyra's entire world. During the day, she moved through her duties like a ghost, counting the hours until she could sleep and be with him again. Caius told her the truth of his reign, the real history that had been erased and rewritten by those who benefited from his disappearance. He had not been a tyrant. He had been a revolutionary. 300 years ago, the kingdom had been even more stratified than it was now, with Omegas treated as property, Betas as servants, and Alphas as gods among mortals. Caius had risen to power young and idealistic, determined to create a society where your designation did not determine your destiny. He had begun passing laws that granted Omegas rights, that allowed Betas to own land, that stripped corrupt Alpha nobles of their absolute authority. The elite had been terrified. They had conspired against him, and his most trusted advisor, a woman named Morgantha, who posed as a wise witch but was secretly in the pay of the noble houses, had engineered his downfall. She had cursed him under the guise of punishing him for crimes he had never committed, then spread lies about his reign, painting him as a monster so that no one would ever try to wake him. His own bloodline, distant cousins who inherited the throne, had been all too happy to maintain the fiction, ruling over a kingdom that slowly slid back into the oppressive hierarchy Caius had tried to dismantle. The current king, Darian, was his great-great-great-great-grandson, and according to Caius, the worst of them all. Lyra listened to these revelations with growing horror and understanding. Everything she had been taught was a lie. The monster in the crystal. Coffin was not a monster at all, but a visionary who had been betrayed and buried to protect the interests of those in power. She asked him about the curse, about whether it could be broken. His expression in the dream had been bleak. He told her the curse was tied to blood magic and ancient power, that it would require someone with both healing magic and pure intentions to unravel it. But more than that, it would require access to Morgantha's original spellwork, which had been destroyed centuries ago, or so everyone believed. However, he had a suspicion. Morgantha had been arrogant and paranoid in equal measure. She would have kept records, hidden them somewhere in the palace, insurance in case her spell ever needed to be adjusted or reinforced. If you are enjoying this story and want to see more supernatural romance content, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring you more tales of destined love and ancient magic. And I love reading your comments about which characters resonate with you most. Now, let's continue with Lyra's dangerous quest to uncover the truth. Lyra became a spy in her own home. During her duties, she paid attention to whispered conversations, to locked rooms and forbidden corridors. She discovered that the palace library had a restricted section that only the royal family could access, and that Darian visited it frequently, always alone, always locking the doors behind him. She needed to get inside that room, but as a lowly Omega servant without even a wolf to her name, she might as well have been trying to reach the moon. The opportunity came unexpectedly during the annual Moon Festival, a week-long celebration when even the strictest protocols were relaxed. The palace filled with visiting dignitaries and nobles, and the servants were stretched thin trying to accommodate everyone. In the chaos, Lyra managed to slip away from her duties and make her way to the restricted library. The lock was warded with magic far beyond her abilities to break, but she had learned a few tricks in her years of tending to prisoners and forgotten spaces. She pulled out a vial of counterspell oil she had stolen from the dungeon stores and carefully applied it to the lock mechanism. The wards flickered and died with a soft hiss, and the door swung open. Inside, the restricted library was smaller than she had expected, but filled with ancient texts and scrolls. She worked quickly, scanning titles, and searching for anything related to curses or Morgantha. Most of the texts were about bloodline magic and royal genealogies, nothing useful. She was about to give up when she noticed a section of the bookshelf that looked slightly different, the wood grain not quite matching. She pressed against it experimentally, and a hidden compartment clicked open. Inside was a single leather-bound journal, its cover marked with Morgantha's seal. Lyra's hands shook as she pulled it out and began to read. The journal was a confession and an insurance policy. Morgantha detailed every step of the curse she had placed on Caius, every ingredient and incantation. But more damning were the entries that came after, where she gloated about her deception, about how she had been paid in land and gold by the noble houses, about how she had personally executed Caius's Omega advisor, a healer named Elira, who had been the only person who truly understood the king's vision. The description of Elira made Lyra's blood run cold. The woman could have been her twin. Same silver hair, same violet eyes, same small stature and gentle demeanor. The resemblance was too specific to be coincidence. She was so absorbed in reading that she did not hear the footsteps until it was too late. The door slammed open, and Alpha King Darian stood framed in the entrance, his face twisted with rage. He was a pale imitation of Caius, shorter and softer, with cruel eyes and a weak chin. His alpha aura crashed over her like a wave, forcing her to her knees. He demanded to know what she was doing, how she had gotten in, what she had found. Lyra clutched the journal to her chest, her mind racing. She could lie, but he would smell the deception. She could run, but she would never make it past him. So she did the only thing she could think of. She told him the truth. She told him she knew about Caius, about the real history, about the curse. She told him she had been communicating with the sleeping king, and that she was going to wake him. Darian's laughter was ugly and sharp. He told her she was even more pathetic than he had thought if she believed she could accomplish such a thing. Then his expression shifted to something more calculating. He informed her that he had known for years that Caius could potentially be awakened, and he had taken steps to ensure it would never happen. Every month, he personally administered a poison into the preservation liquid, a slow-acting toxin designed to destroy Caius from the inside, even as the stasis kept him technically alive. In another few decades, there would be nothing left to wake, just an empty husk in a crystal cage. Lyra felt rage unlike anything she had ever experienced. It burned through her veins, igniting something deep in her core that had always been dormant. Her magic, her pathetic, weak healing magic, suddenly roared to life with an intensity that made the air around her crackle with power. Darian stumbled back, shocked. For the first time in her life, Lyra felt her wolf, not emerging fully but present, a silver shadow that pressed against her consciousness with fierce protectiveness. She realized in that moment what Caius had suspected but never told her. She was not broken. She was descended from Elira, and Elira had not been a simple healer. She had been a moon witch, beings of legend who possessed healing magic so powerful it could reverse death itself. The bloodline had been diluted over generations, but it was still there, dormant, until awakened by desperate need and righteous fury. Darian tried to use his alpha command on her, that supernatural compulsion that should have forced her to submit. But her wolf, small as it was, defied him. Moon witches answered to no authority but their own hearts. She ran, clutching the journal, her newly awakened magic propelling her faster than she had ever moved before. Darian's guards pursued her, but she knew the servant corridors better than anyone. She made it to the dungeon, to the chamber of the crystal tomb, and sealed herself inside with every ward and barrier she could muster. She knew it would not hold forever. Darian would break through eventually, but she did not need forever. She only needed enough time. She opened the journal to the section describing the curse-breaking ritual. It was complex, requiring specific ingredients and perfect timing. But Morgantha had been thorough in her documentation. The curse could only be broken during the dark moon, when the veil between consciousness and sleep was thinnest, and it required the blood of a moon witch, freely given with pure intentions. Lyra checked the lunar calendar etched into the chamber wall. Tonight was the dark moon. It was as if fate itself had been waiting for this moment. She gathered what she needed from the dungeon stores, ingredients for rituals that had been locked away and forgotten. She prepared the circle around the crystal coffin, marking it with symbols from the journal. And then she waited for moonless midnight, the darkest hour, when the chamber would be filled with nothing but shadow and possibility. When the hour came, she could hear Darian and his guards hammering against the sealed doors. The wards were beginning to crack. She had minutes at most. She began the incantation, her voice steady despite her fear. The words were ancient, a language that predated the modern kingdom, flowing from her tongue as if she had always known them. The crystal coffin began to glow, the liquid inside churning and bubbling. She reached the final line of the spell, the one that required blood sacrifice. She drew a silver dagger across her palm, hissing at the pain, and pressed her bleeding hand against the crystal directly over Caius's heart. Her blood sizzled against the surface, and for a terrifying moment nothing happened. Then the crystal exploded. The liquid vaporized in an instant, and Caius's body fell forward. Lyra caught him, or tried to, both of them collapsing to the floor in a tangle of limbs. He was heavy and cold, and not breathing. Panic seized her. She had been too late. The poison had already done its work, but her wolf surged inside her, and her magic poured out of her hands into his chest, seeking the spark of life that must still exist somewhere in him. She felt it, buried deep beneath layers of toxin and curse and despair, a tiny ember of his soul. She fed that ember with everything she had, her power blazing like the sun, burning away the poison, and the darkness until suddenly he gasped and his eyes flew open. Those eyes, burning gold and ancient and alive, fixed on her with recognition and wonder. He whispered her name, not Lyra, but Elira, and she understood. She was the reincarnation, the descendant, the second chance that the universe had given them. His hand, shaking and weak, reached up to cup her face, solid and real this time. He told her he remembered everything, not just his own life, but Elira's too. Memories that had been locked in his blood magic, waiting for the moment when their souls would find each other again. They had been lovers 300 years ago. They had been partners in revolution, and they had been torn apart by those who feared the world they were trying to build. The doors finally burst open. Darian and a dozen guards rushed in, weapons drawn. They stopped short when they saw Caius standing, weak but alive, his arm around Lyra protectively. The resemblance between Darian and his ancient ancestor was obvious now, but where Caius radiated true power and authority, Darian looked like a cheap copy, a pretender suddenly faced with the real thing. Caius's voice, unused for 3 centuries, was rough but commanding as he addressed his descendant. He declared that he reclaimed his throne by right of blood and conquest. and that Darian's reign of corruption ended now. Darian tried to rally his guards, commanding them to kill the intruders. But alphas recognized true dominance when they faced it, and not a single guard moved to obey. What followed was a transformation that took years, not the instant resolution of a fairy tale, but the hard work of genuine change. Caius was weak from his ordeal and needed months to recover his full strength. During that time, Lyra nursed him back to health, while also having to navigate the complicated political situation his return had created. Much of the kingdom did not want to believe that the legendary tyrant king had returned, and those who did believe were split between those who feared him and those who hoped he was the savior from prophecy. Darian had fled the palace and was gathering loyalists in the provinces, nobles who benefited from the current oppressive system and had no desire to see it dismantled. A civil war seemed inevitable, but Caius had learned from his first reign. He understood now that change imposed from above, no matter how well-intentioned, would always breed resistance. This time, he needed to build from the ground up to empower the very people his reforms would protect. He and Lyra traveled the kingdom in disguise, speaking with omegas and betas, and even progressive-minded alphas, building a coalition of those who dreamed of something better. They shared their own story, the truth of the past and the possibilities of the future. Slowly, support began to grow. The bond between Caius and Lyra deepened during this time in ways that transcended their past life connection. They were soulmates. Yes, destined mates whose souls recognized each other across centuries. But they were also two people who had to choose each other every day, who had to learn each other's quirks and flaws and fears. Caius had to confront the guilt of his first reign, the mistakes he had made in his youth, the people who had suffered because he had been too idealistic and not strategic enough. Lyra had to accept her power and her heritage, to step into the role of Moon Witch, and all the responsibility that came with it. Their love was not the cure for their trauma, but the foundation that made healing possible. The final confrontation with Darian came not on a battlefield, but in a court of judgment. Caius had gathered enough support to call a grand council, a gathering of representatives from every pack and province in the kingdom. Both he and Darian presented their cases before the people, not as kings demanding obedience, but as candidates seeking the trust of those they wished to lead. Darian spoke of tradition and stability, warning that Caius's radical ideas would destroy the natural order. Caius spoke of justice and dignity, showing the scars of those who had suffered under the current system, including Lyra's burn scars and the stories of countless others. He presented Morgantha's journal as evidence of the conspiracy that had overthrown him, the truth that had been hidden for 3 centuries. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The people chose Caius, chose change, chose hope over fear. Darian was stripped of his title and exiled, not executed, because Caius refused to start his new reign with bloodshed. The former king left cursing them all, swearing that the kingdom would collapse into chaos. But he was wrong. Over the next decade, Caius and Lyra systematically reformed every unjust law and institution. They abolished the caste system that had divided alphas, betas, and omegas into rigid hierarchies. They established schools that taught everyone regardless of designation, councils that gave all people a voice in governance, and protections for the most vulnerable members of society. It was not easy. There were setbacks and resistance, moments when it seemed the entire endeavor would crumble under the weight of centuries of prejudice and hatred. But every time progress seemed impossible, Caius and Lyra would return to the people, would listen to their concerns, and adjust their approach. They led not as tyrants imposing their will, but as servants, dedicated to the well-being of all, and slowly, painfully, beautifully, the kingdom began to transform. On their 10th anniversary of Caius's awakening, they were formally bonded in a ceremony that blended ancient traditions with new customs they had created together. Lyra wore silver and moonlight, her wolf finally fully manifested and beautiful. Caius wore the crown not of a conqueror, but of a king chosen by his people. When they exchanged their vows, speaking of partnership and equality and love that transcended time itself, there was not a dry eye in the assembled crowd. Their bond snapped into place with a force that shook the very foundations of the palace, a mating mark that glowed like starlight appearing on both their necks, visible proof of a connection that was both destiny and choice. They had 3 children over the following years, each born with the combined gifts of their parents. The eldest, a daughter they named Alira, in honor of the past, was an alpha with healing, magic. The middle child, a son named Theron, was a beta with the strategic mind of a scholar. The youngest, another daughter called Celeste, was an omega with prophetic dreams who would one day become the greatest seer the kingdom had ever known. Caius and Lyra raised them not to inherit power, but to serve others, teaching them that true strength came from lifting people up, rather than holding them down. Before we reach the end of this incredible journey, I want to remind you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Caius and Lyra's story? Have you ever felt connected to someone in a way that seemed to transcend logic or time? And don't forget to subscribe for more supernatural romance stories that explore the power of love to transform not just individuals, but entire worlds. The epilogue of their story took place 30 years after Caius first opened his eyes in Lyra's dreams. They stood together in the crystal chamber, which had been transformed into a memorial and museum. The crystal coffin remained as a reminder of what had been, and what must never be allowed to happen again. Tourists and students visited regularly to learn about the dark period when truth had been suppressed, and tyranny had hidden behind lies. Caius and Lyra, both now showing touches of silver in their hair but still strong and devoted, served as guides sometimes, sharing their story with new generations. A young Omega approached them that day, small and uncertain, without a wolf, and clearly ashamed of it. She asked Lyra if it was true that she had once been powerless, if she really had been considered broken. Lyra knelt down to the girl's level and took her hands gently. She told her that power was not about the strength of your wolf or the force of your magic, but about the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the whole world told you to stay down. She told her that some of the strongest people she had ever known had been those the world considered weak, and that true change always began with those who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The girl left with tears in her eyes, but hope in her heart. Caius wrapped his arm around Lyra's waist, pulling her close. He told her she was still the most magnificent thing he had ever seen, still the light that had saved him from eternal darkness. She smiled up at him, that same gentle smile that had first reached him through centuries of cursed sleep, and replied that he was still the most frustrating and wonderful partner she could have asked for, in this life, and the one before. They had not created a perfect kingdom. Prejudice and inequality still existed, and there were always those who sought power over others. But they had created a foundation, a system where justice was possible, where every person had the right to dignity and the opportunity to thrive. They had proven that change was possible, that the patterns of the past did not have to define the future, and that love, real love that chose justice over comfort and truth over tradition, could indeed transform the world. As the sun set over the palace, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Caius and Lyra walked hand in hand through gardens that now welcomed people of all designations. Children played without fear, Omegas held positions of authority, Betas owned businesses, and Alphas learned that true leadership meant service rather than dominance. It had taken 300 years and a curse and the desperate courage of one lonely healer who refused